This is the GERPISA North American COVID-19 Roundtable. This is the second of 4 roundtables. Yesterday's was on COVID-19 in Asia, today on North America, tomorrow on EU, on Friday on Brazil, Mexico, and India. For those of you who are watching this on streaming this live on YouTube, you can enter questions and in the chat portion of the YouTube of the YouTube video, and they will get to us, and then we will ask questions as part of our program here today. We've got 3 major questions that we're looking at. One has to do with a short-term perspective on what have been the impacts of COVID-19 crisis on the auto sector in the US and Canada. What have governments done to respond to the initial shock? And what's the impact of the crisis on the supply chain, and how does it differ along the supply chain? That's one of the first questions that we'll look at. The next question looks at before the crisis, the industry was struggling with a series of structural trends, greening of vehicles, shift of global demand in Asia, increasing automation and digitization of transportation of modes. Now all these were implying massive investments and adaptations in business models and creation of new business models. How do we see these trends evolving in coming years? To what extent do we think it will continue shaping the future of work and employment in the industry? And finally, in the last question, we're going to look at, since the outbreak of the crisis, we've heard many calls for shortening value chains and bringing home activities that are considered strategic, and bringing production closer to final demand. And given the current fragmentation of production in the auto sector, because it is a global industry, do you think it's feasible that we could be possible? Is this feasible, and what could be the possible outcome for jobs? And here we're focusing on North America. More generally, what should be the answer of public authorities to help the industry with its challenges? And we have 4 speakers today. We have myself. My name is Bruce Belzowski. I'm the Managing Director of the Automotive Futures Group in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm retired from the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute. We have Thomas Clear, from the Senior Economist and Research Advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago. We have Mike Smitka. He's a Professor Emeritus of Economics at Washington and Lee University here in the US. And we have Greg Mordew, who's Associate Professor in the Faculty of Engineering at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario in Canada. Thank you all, gentlemen, for joining us today. Let's start with our first question. I'm going to stop sharing, and now we have our speakers here. Thomas, when you start talking, let's start with the first question. We look at the short-term perspective. What have you seen as the impacts of COVID-19 on the auto sector in the U.S.?
Thank you, Bruce. And first of all, thanks for being invited to be part of this distinguished panel. You know, we're supposed to have our GERPISA colloquium in Detroit, so the next best thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about a global pandemic in 4 panels. So thanks, Bruce, for moderating, and thanks to Greg and Mike. And then I have one disclaimer I have to put out up front. Bruce correctly stated that my employer is the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. However, what I'm about to say during this broadcast does not necessarily represent the opinion of anybody at the Chicago Fed or anywhere else in the Federal Reserve System, but it does represent my own opinion. So there you have it. So back to the question, what about short-term impacts as they've played out across the United States? And my answer sort of falls into 2 buckets. I want to think about this through on the demand side for vehicles and on the supply side for vehicles. As the virus rolled out, so whatever we observed has been driven by the virus. So that's number one. You know, there was the whole element of getting the hands around how to deal with it, and in the locations where the epidemic was the worst, We had then serious shutdowns for almost all commercial activities, stay-at-home orders and such. And of course, that affected what happened in the auto industry. It had to be sorted out what's an essential business. In some states, auto retailing was essentially not declared an essential business and so on and so forth. That all got sorted out. So as the virus started hitting spatially those areas, vehicle sales went in the tank right away. That recovered actually remarkably well. If you think about us being in a recession, you look at the level of unemployment rate, people without jobs, the first thing that you usually do is you stay away from purchasing durable goods. Here we are in, what's today, 1st of July. So vehicle sales for June are going to be announced probably during or right after this panel is over. People are expecting an annual rate for this year for the US somewhere in the neighborhood between 11 and 12 million units on a CISA adjusted annual rate. That's not as good as we had it last year, but that's not a bad number. It's certainly significantly better than it was in 2008. We're observing that the retail structure has adjusted to delivering vehicles in a no-touch basis. You either make an appointment or they deliver the vehicle to your house. You can close on the loan or you can pay cash with the help of your bank at the curb. You can spec the vehicle online. So these things have actually worked out remarkably well, considering how severe of a downturn we're experiencing. On the production side, that's a slightly different story because you have to understand that in all of North America, light vehicle assembly was shut down for essentially 2 months, from the middle of March to the middle of May. Subsequently, the producers have been ramping up rather quickly. Several plants are up to 3 shifts. They're not at the same line speed. And why is that? Because they have new protocols in place to make sure the workforce is safe. Those things, my understanding is, seem to be working out remarkably well. And why did car makers go there? Because if you have no revenue coming in, that starts hurting. And so interestingly enough, by the beginning of May, light vehicle inventories were at extremely low levels, especially for the best-selling vehicles. So we can get into the truck or the crossover side. And those were the plants that were ramped up the fastest. So things from auto specifically, it looked like a very sharp decline, both on supply and demand, but it's not quite as bad as you would think relative to what else is going on in the economy. And I'm going to stop right there.
All right, thank you, Thomas. Mike, what's your take on this?
Okay, first, just a reminder that hopefully next June, we will be about this time having our gala at the Ford Piquette Avenue plant in Detroit. Okay, back to topic. I'd like to embed this in some of the longer run changes in the US. We've had, as Thomas indirectly noted, a shift from sedans to light trucks. And in fact, the last detailed data that were available for the first quarter, pickup trucks alone outsold sedans in the US market, and Canada is probably quite similar in that regard. So that is placing stress on specific plants and specific suppliers or production lines at suppliers. Second, and this is not true of Canada, the US has a very large, let's call it contingent labor force, and the auto industry has shifted towards far fewer unionized workers, lower pay structures, very little in the way of benefits. And this will produce a lot of strain on the labor force. Third, we are coming off of peak auto, some really, really good times for the industry. And with more money than they knew what to do with, the industry has spent a lot of money on things that not only are not profitable, but things such as autonomy that don't even generate any revenue. So I would expect one of the short run changes to be a paring back of expenditures. Electrification is driven much more by regulation, but that has its own story. And then the globalization later on today. And finally, we should really embed this discussion in terms of the value chain. We have the bankruptcy not just of Hertz, but of many smaller car rental companies. And depending on how bankruptcy handles it, there will be a push of those vehicles into auction markets with reverberations on used car prices. So we've seen some real gyrations down and now back up in used car prices. And because most transactions in the US are replacement demand, and used car vehicle sales are roughly 2.5 for every new car sale, what happens to used car prices will change the nature of what's going on in new cars. So I think we still have some shocks ahead there because of challenges in the dealership side. Off-lease vehicles haven't been feeding back into dealerships and into the used car chain. So there are many stresses there. And then to pick up very briefly one thing that Thomas mentioned, the push to improve digital transactions. So several years ago, we visited a used car auction in Japan, which was already primarily online. There were certainly live bidders, but they were dominated by non-live bidders. In the US, that transaction has not yet gone through all the way. And this is the COVID is going to shift the nature of Mannheim and Odessa, the two big players, who will be moving away from live auction lanes with people standing there waving their hands to a much more heavy orientation to digital transactions. So everyone has some presence there, but this is going to take and change that to where even the small dealers who aren't particularly progressive are going to have people who now can do that out of reflex. Okay, stop there for now.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Greg, let me unmute you. You have the floor.
Well, I think that I'll speak primarily from the perspective of Canada. After all, this is July 1st, which is Canada Day, so we'll all celebrate that. But we're celebrating it in a slightly different, through a slightly different lens this year. Insofar as the automotive industry in this country is concerned, I think a lot of the trends that Mike and Thomas have articulated about the U.S. Environment are replicating themselves in Canada. After all, this is a very much an integrated automotive industry. We're looking at unemployment rates of about 13.5%, which is about 2.5 times normal, the current level, and that looks like it's going to persist for a while. Our GDP is down by a similar level over the May to May, and so we're seeing auto sales obviously decline commensurately, which is also a reflection of the fact that driving is down in this country by about 40% year over year. People don't need cars, so people aren't buying cars unless they have that innate need to have a new car, and it's not easy to buy them because, as Mike and Thomas have described, they have transitioned quite nicely, but to a touchless process. From a manufacturing perspective, we're also looking at numbers that are very much the same across North America. Manufacturing or production levels in Canada are down about 40% year to date, which I think is very similar to the U.S. And we started to, May numbers are out and they look very similar to the U.S. and June numbers, when they come out today or tomorrow, will be more interesting because they reflect a return to something closer to normal. So I'm anxious to have a look at that. But all the factories that were running in March are now running again at full complement of their workforce. Although as we heard before, their line speed is down significantly, although it's moving back up. And that was a reflection, as much as it's a reflection of demand, but it's also a reflection I've heard on from a couple of assembly plants as a reflection of being off for 2 months and basic issues of work hardening, getting back into the swing of making cars again. Over the short term, the bigger crisis challenges are probably in the supplier community than they are at the OEM level. The cash flow is starting to rear its head as a bit of an issue for some companies, and they'll work their way through that. And some of the OEMs have been quite creative in terms of finding mechanisms to support their supplier base. But they also, some of the tier 2s and tier 3s that don't pay as well are going to start actually, even though unemployment rates are up to 13, 14% in Ontario, they're going to have, where the vast majority of the Canadian automotive manufacturing industry is, they're going to start experiencing labor problems because because we have a very generous and put in place very quickly a very generous social support system, where the social support system is very close to the lower end of wages in the tier 2s and 3s, and temporary people that previously took some of those positions are reticent to do so in the context of the current availability of social support systems. So we'll have to, I'm going to watch that very closely as those support systems start to get ratcheted back over the coming weeks and months, and see what happens to those tier 2s and 3s. So the industry looks a lot the same. There are some unique requirements in Canada that are going to manifest soon, and we'll keep an eye on them.
Thanks very much, Greg. I think you guys have touched on many of the things that I'm seeing as well. There's definitely a lot of pessimism in the lower tiers of the supply base. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether they're going to be able to make it through in terms of being able to, we may see some bankruptcies along the way here. This is definitely one of the issues that the suppliers are talking about in the US as well as in Canada. Of course, there's the issues related to the USMCA and the adapting of that, which goes into effect today, where all the issues related to USMCA are supposed to be figured out by now, right? And I think the manufacturers and the suppliers have until end of the year to help sort some of this stuff out. But still, it's another thing on top of the pandemic that they have to deal with. I think that's really from the supply base. I think those are some of the big issues. Consumers, as Thomas said and Mike said, it's definitely a recession type attitude. Not necessarily for the luxury buyers, but for many buyers. When we know what happens, we've seen recessions now. We know what happens is that people delay and they delay buying. Sometimes they even delay maintenance. And they focus a little more on used cars, and I think that the point about dealerships looking at being more low touch, I think it's something that's definitely is going to change in the dealership body. We're starting to see that from the manufacturers, and as you guys were saying, I agree that it's been so much different from 2008, 2009, 2010 when we had two manufacturers go bankrupt in the U.S. And actually, the U.S. manufacturers seem to be doing pretty good. I don't see them doing in terms of having funding, having assets available. We'll talk about how they're using those assets in the next question, but compared to 2008, 2009, they're not struggling the way they were. It was fascinating to see them actually try as soon as they could to try to get back up to speed. They got delayed mostly by the states who said, we're not quite ready to come back yet. And then when they were come back, we really want you to show us that you're going to be able to protect our workers. And UAW held back for a little bit, for about a week or so, at least a week, maybe 2 weeks, held back because they didn't think the original plans from the manufacturers were good enough to protect them when they came back. But now things are pretty much moving along pretty good. I think one of the issues I think one of you guys have already spoken about it, had to do with the issue of people coming back. Oh, Greg said of the benefits that are available. And we have benefits in the social benefits in the US. I think they go until the end of July, where some people will get an extra $600 a month for unemployment. And in some particular jobs, it's better for them. It's cheap. They make more money staying home than actually working. This is not necessarily the case for autos. So I think this is one thing that we're seeing. Let's see what else I got here. I think that's all. I'll stop right now, and let's go on to our next question. Thomas, you're first up, and here we're looking at issues related to the investments, future industry trends, investments of the manufacturers. How do you see this playing out? And also with a little nod to employment.
Okay. So that gets harder as we look into the future. So let me thanks, Bruce, for the question. Let me put a little perspective on this, right? So let's just put ourselves back to what the mindset of the industry was before the pandemic hit. And it was essentially a matter of which of these major trends is going to hit first. There was very little doubt that internal combustion engine had peaked, and it was just a matter of time. Massive investments. You remember from the North American context, several manufacturers, General Motors in particular, would sort of did proactive staff cutback, some engineering work related to internal combustion engines, some other work in order to free up some retrenchment on markets in order to sort of free up their cash flow situation going forward to afford these strategic investments at a time when the companies were profitable. That's remarkable. That's usually something you don't see outside of a recession. So then the pandemic hit, and nobody sees that coming. It affects the global industry and affects economies around the world. So now what do we do going forward with these longer term trends? So the immediate effect, I think, was very clear. Everybody took a timeout, okay? You hit the stop button right away because you needed to go into preserve cash flow mode. So for 2 or 3 months, nothing was happening. Now going forward, everybody alluded to the fact that in North America, production has all plants are in operation, probably not the same line speed, but they're getting there. They have new protocols. So things are looking pretty good. What does this mean for the strategic objectives and for the major trends reshaping the industry going forward? That's a very hard question to answer. I think it's not because I feel like I don't know anything about it. It's just because the uncertainty is so high. Part of this is going to the underlying demand picture, right? So it was just a matter of time and nobody was going to own a vehicle anymore. Well, shared rides in the context of a pandemic has a totally different connotation to it. So we don't know how long this is going to last, how much this is going to shape consumer behavior. There's considerable talk about, the switch out of public transit to private transportation having some legs to it. To the extent that that's going to play out, that will, of course, be driven entirely, one would think, or primarily first order by what happens to the virus, how long this thing's going to be around. At one point, we're going to get this under control, but the longer it lasts, the more permanent the shifts are going to be. So that affects some of the drivers right off the bat. So the rose is off the, the bloom is off the rose, I guess, if you will. I would think the decisions going forward have been scaled back a level. There are things going forward that obviously are profitable and that need to happen. You may have seen recently, so the digital platforms, they are in full swing. This was started by Tesla. General Motors caught up, I think it was in the middle of last year, and then Ford just released a new F-150. It's on a full digital platform. These things are going forward. This is coming. This will happen. The virus is not changing any of that. As far as all the other forces, I think that sort of remains to be seen. From my perspective, we're a little early in the game. I would think that what you do at this point, you sort of regroup and you focus on the marginal steps that have a much sooner sort of profitability window attached to them. And I think, yes, I think that's all I have at this point. So why don't I turn it back to Bruce?
Thank you, Thomas. Of course, one of the things that we didn't mention is that there is 20% unemployment in the US right now. And this is something we have not seen since the Depression. When you look back on the numbers, not even during the recession in 2008, 2009, did we see 20% unemployment. So many people say, oh, it's just temporary, and we hope it is. But Mike, let's have your say on this.
Yes, I think that it's very easy to underrate the extent of chaos in the US political economy and the depth and severity and the length that this recession will have. So what I see is more or less across the US, first, there is no such thing as US policy on the pandemic. And we are seeing a number of states that are going to really move into crisis mode where hospitals will be totally overwhelmed. And that will take months to turn around. So I think what we'll see is another shutdown occurring across the industry and greater panic. It will certainly last into next year. So what are some of the ramifications of this? I think if I were a global supplier, I would start rethinking whether I want to have a big global R&D center in Ann Arbor. I can't currently get my staff into the US. I can't get staff out of the US. And H-1B visas, the high skill visas, that has been ended. This was supposed to be something, the US had this system of checks and balances that even if you got the occasional odd figure in the Senate or even in the White House, we would never see these sorts of extreme shifts. But I think if you look at the US, and I can make some parallel arguments for China, we're seeing political systems that are really dysfunctional and out of touch with some of the core needs. And for a global supplier that is really dependent on being able to use their central R&D facilities, which for air conditioning heat exchangers may be in Krakow in Poland, and for air conditioning valves may be in Hangzhou in China, you nevertheless have to have some ways to coordinate this. And the US is no longer looking like a reliable place. Some of that may spill over into Ontario, but North America as a whole, I think, is at risk of its leadership position in the auto industry. So to bring out a contrarian view.
Very good, Mike. Yeah, this issue of how we're going to deal with the one of the questions has already popped up, and actually more of a comment, is that it's surprising that sales will drop so little, considering that the present level of high unemployment in the U.S. I guess the issue is we really haven't talked about, I think someone talked about 11 to 12 million vehicles. I've seen 14 to 15 million. It's talking about 20 to 30% reduction in sales for the year. If we actually came in at 15 million, I think everybody'd be happy. I know that in the past, we've been at 17 million and making pretty good money at 17 million. And I know historically we've been working at something like, if you make, especially this was true in the 90s, and I don't know if it's changed that much. In the 90s, if we had a 15 million year, everybody was making money. So I think that we have certain expectations about how the manufacturers have certain bets that they're placing, suppliers as well, about how much money they're expecting to make. But I think if we came in at 14, 15 million, people would be really happy in some ways compared to if we come in at 12 million, which I think will be really, really a tough one. Greg, what do you got to say?
Well, I'm probably closer to what I mean. There are so many variables that are in play right now, and the industry is probably more dynamic and not all in a good way than it's ever been in the past. So to get a sense of what we're looking at over the intermediate to the longer term is very, very difficult. There are so many balls in the air. I mean, there are going to be lasting changes because of COVID-19. I would propose that those changes will be less over the long term than some of us are anticipating or talking about in the world of today, because this industry has had a long history of dealing with crisis, whether it's 2008, 09, or 2010, or any other time, and talking about, you know, limiting supply chains, and then at the end of the day making decisions that are entirely based on cost and forgetting about the issues that they experienced in 2009 and then reverting back to cost, or forgetting about the issues that they had around the supply chain as a result of a tsunami and reverting to cost. And the industry has a shorter than one might anticipate memory for those kinds of things. And meanwhile, there are so many other dynamics that are affecting the industry. And you mentioned one 10 or 15 minutes ago, Bruce, the implementation of the USMCA today. And in any other environment, that would be the story of the year. And now it's one of those also rans that oh yeah, USMCA. And so we're trying to figure out that, and you look at that and you say, you compare that with what's going to happen as a result of the pandemic. I say we're going to revert to cost, and then you look at USMCA, and is the $16 per hour labor cost of 40%, is that going to have an effect? Some observers say it's going to have a huge effect, or will it have no effect at all, because companies are just going to say, you know what, 2.5% into the US, we'll take our lumps and we'll go into Mexico all in and pay $3, $4, $5 an hour, not $16 an hour, and we'll take it on the 2.5. So there are, you know, you can look up and you can look down, but it's very difficult to anticipate where the industry is ultimately going to land. I've heard a lot of discussion, because I'm doing some research on it now, about the impact of Industry 4.0 on the automotive industry. My sense is it's going to have less of an impact than people that are in the business are anticipating, because those impacts are going to happen incrementally, slowly, piece by piece. So how do you compare pandemic with Industry 4.0 to electric vehicles, to autonomous vehicles, to USMCA, and throw them all in a mix? And that's a much better economist than I am that can anticipate the eventual outcome. You can look at those things individually and make a prognostication, but it's very difficult when you try to attach weighted likelihoods of each occurring. So that's my long answer to say it's very
that was well within your 5-minute time. Thank you. This issue about all the money that the manufacturers have been putting into the other technologies, to mobility, to autonomous vehicles and EVs. This was also part of this question, and we talked a little bit about it. I think someone is saying these are types of things that in R&D that are on the back burner now. I know in some cases, some of the manufacturers have already jettisoned the mobility projects. They're off the books now. And in terms of the other technologies, I think I'm expecting a lot of slowdown in those in terms of how much money they're spending. Again, these were basically R&D projects coming out of R&D budgets. And as we know, R&D is usually a slower process than product development. Once you start putting money in the product development, something is going to happen. You've made a decision to do that. R&D could be slowed down. It can be, we can speed it up. You can pull it back. You have more flexibility. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Now our next question looks at the issue of, really it's looking at the globalization story, right? You're talking about bringing back activities, bringing home activities. That fits in the story that Greg was telling about the USMCA. Really, given the way that the industry is organized now and has been organized for the last 20 years in terms of being a global industry, right? Is it feasible for companies to start bringing things back? Let's start with you, Thomas.
Mute. Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, so let's, that's an important question. And of course, the most important questions are the ones that determine long-term trends. And in a way, that's sort of what the GERPISA network is all about, thinking big questions, and then hopefully we get some of the answers right. But so let me start with first principles. So you said you emphasized two elements in your question that I want to reiterate. There's no doubt that the automobile industry is global. However, when you look at how these global companies operate, they exist as a collection of regional production networks. Vehicles and parts, for the most part, are being produced in the region in which they're sold, right? In North America, about 80% of vehicles sold in North America are actually produced in North America. So you have to keep that in mind. I think you start from that. Anyway, that's where I started when I answer your question. So along comes the pandemic. What have we discovered in the pandemic? Many borders have been closed, not necessarily to trade, because trade probably doesn't have people moving along with the goods. You put the goods on airplanes or on boats, and then, there's people on the other end to unload them and all that. So that stuff's still going forward to my understanding. But initially there was confusion. Bruce alluded to the fact that, okay, if you have to have people fly around, you have global R&D centers. That's probably a slightly different question. So I'm not going to go there for now. I'm just going to focus on the production side. So from that perspective, it seems to me that I would submit that it's not the pandemic that's the most important driver going forward, but rather what parameters are changing sort of for the North American region. And the most important one going forward that's changing effective today, with a grace period now extended to the end of the calendar year, is that new trade agreement for North America. So, everybody, all major vehicle producers and parts producers are active in North America. They now have to and they have been asking themselves the question for months, what do these new parameters mean for us in terms of reorganizing our supply chain? And so my sense is it's not necessarily a question of bringing things in to North America from outside. It's rather a question of optimizing how you utilize the economic space that's referred to as North America. Greg referred to that. Do I just bite the bullet and pay the tariff and then move operations out of Canada straight up into Mexico, even though I can't make the wage hurdle that's going to be required, and just pay the WTO tariff? These are the decisions, I think, that are from the perspective of North America, which is what our panel is supposed to be considering. I think these dominate what's going forward in terms of resorting the supply chain. At the margin, so let's say maybe you're building in some permanently higher level of uncertainty that you want to account for. There are some other tools available. I mean, remember when NUMMI produced vehicles in California? Toyota was running the operations, and that ran on the just-in-time system, but nobody's delivered just-in-time to NUMMI because there was no supply base anywhere nearby. So what they did is they set up a whole staging system of warehouses. You delivered a supplier just-in-time to the warehouse, and from there, Toyota took care of it. and or NUMI rather, because it was technically run by GM and Toyota together. So that's a margin you can have, right? You can have slightly higher buffers. Nothing's going to stop you there from that may be the intermediate solution instead of reorganizing your entire sort of value and supply chain. So to wrap it up, my answer on this, I think I think the focus is going to be on what USMCA is going to do to sort of recalibrate the footprint. Every major production region in the world has a low-cost production country, at least one of them, or production region in it. And of course, for North America, that is Mexico. And the constraints in which you can integrate Mexico are changing with USMCA. And so that's probably going more important for the region than what the pandemic offers to anybody makes plans for supply chains. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And thanks, Thomas. Yeah, I think it really brings some good points about the U.S. and the move. It's been regionalization for many years. It really is. The globalization has really been regionalization. We just had a conference on the story of deglobalizing recently, and it really looked at that issue. Mike, what's your take on this?
I think I'm mute. Okay, I'm unmuted now. First, if we look at the initial impact of the closure of China, there was very little outside of China and to a lesser extent, Korea and Japan. In other words, the places that would have been closest to being just in time. So this regionalization of supply chains and the ability of large OEMs and tier ones to look up or down upstream and identify where they are sourcing which input down to pigments and other sorts of things. That really got a big impetus after the tsunami in Japan and then the follow on with the floods in Thailand. So that's really a success story, this ability to manage risk across the supply chain and to have production occurring on a regional basis. I want to return very briefly, though, to how going forward would you as a multinational want to organize your operations? Where do you put your R&D? How do you do this coordination? The word decoupling was already being used with people looking at the US-China relationship prior to Trump. So concerns that we might not want to have trade going between the US and China, the magnitude that had been occurring. And some of this was driven by a conflation of things happening in textiles and garments, and very far removed from the auto industry. Of course, China is the world's biggest market. It had been the biggest source of profits for GM and Volkswagen, and for, potentially for some of the tier ones that had the better positioning inside the Chinese market. So how do you go about organizing this when the ability to use the US as a base has been called into question, given travel restrictions, trade restrictions, and this cuts across the political spectrum, even if Trump is a bit more of a loose cannon than even his critics up front could have anticipated. So I think this remains one of the things looking over the longer run is where are and how are suppliers in particular going to coordinate this? So again, this may work to the advantage of Canada, but I think it is not particularly good news for the US.
I think Mike, I think the regionalization story also plays out. It has to do with the, and I think we've already talked a little bit about this, is that will there be a shift in jobs from Mexico to the US? What's your take on that?
Basically, no.
No? Because?
For one thing, I have tried to ask and have been unable to find anyone who had actual data on what the cost structure, how many jobs met this $16 per hour status. I talked to someone, Industry Canada, back in, I guess it was January. And, it's basically a blank slate. Now, maybe Bruce, through your conferences, or Thomas, perhaps you can't talk about it if it's coming through the Fed. There's a bit more data now, but I really don't see big shifts in jobs occurring thanks to USMCA.
I was looking at the story.
R&D is a different story.
Yeah, I was looking at that talk. I was talking about this a few years ago when USMCA was first starting coming out, and I had an article from the New York Times that said 40% of value of the vehicle was already being produced in Canada and the U.S., particularly powertrains. All those things got shipped to as part of the whole process, were then put into vehicles in Mexico. So if 40% was already being done, this is even before USMCA was even mentioned, then they've already met their role, the mark that they needed to make. And this is something that, we've seen before, where the manufacturers usually get their way. They work their way through the system. They walk the government people through the process, and then the government people say, okay, yeah, I can see where you're coming from here, but let's do some other things. So
let me add one little thing. I've not tried to read through the detailed guidelines, which were only recently released. So, just trying to implement the USMCA is only now starting to be possible because the government, the USTR, had not come out with the details of what you would need to do in practice. But if you look at, there are fairly large carve-outs for presence of R&D, other things that mean that you can count a lot of things towards that 40% that are not even production-based. And that, I think, provides a lot of ability to cover the rear end, as it were, for car companies, that these requirements are probably going to be much less severe in practice than they sound at first in rhetoric.
Very good, thank you. Greg, what's your take on this?
Well, just to continue on that conversation a little bit about the 40%, I think we have to be, I think Mike raises an important point about the additional carve-outs, but and I think he's quite right in terms of watching the dynamics of these discussions unfold between Industry Canada, for example, and all of the OEMs and similar circumstances in the US, and as the USMCA worked its way through the path. The reality, though, is that 40% is a really interesting number, and it's going to be, and each company will need to carve out their own strategy going forward to either get there or not. And if they're not, and if it's a big leap to get there, they won't try to get there, and they will say, okay, I guess we're in for our regionalization strategy requires a 6.1% tariff into Canada and a 2.5% tariff in the US. We'll take a big deep breath and hope that we can get it out at the back end, and we'll have to see how that unfolds. But there's I'm back to, in answer to the original question, I'm back to where I started from, that this industry has not demonstrated a history of making decisions over the long-term basis through long-term memory. And I think my sense is that there will be some adjustments and some consideration given to sourcing decisions that are made in the here and now, for the now and the intermediate term future. But over the long term, this will start to drift away, and decisions will be made purely on cost. And those decisions happen at 5 to 7 year intervals on a model by model basis, as opposed to a company-wide, this is where we're moving now. And I'm sure that if we look in a purchasing principles guidelines from any of the OEMs 3 or 5 or 7 years from now, there will be no principle that says, quote unquote, because of the lessons learned during COVID-19, about limiting the supply chain. The reality as well is that, as Thomas and Mike and Bruce, you as well have pointed out, this is a global pandemic. So limiting the supply chain is not going to change. It is not necessarily driven by the pandemic. It's driven by other factors because it's everywhere. And there's no short, intermediate, or long-term benefit of making an adjustment to the underlying premise by which decisions are made in this industry, and that is cost.
Very good. Thank you. One of the issues that we've been hearing something about, and it's somewhat related to this, has to do with the issue of it's called stakeholder value versus shareholder value, and Greg, it fits into the story that you were talking about in terms of they're going to be focusing on cost, meaning they're going to be focusing on profit, and if they're looking at profit, it's always going to. In the past, it's been shareholder value. Stakeholder value says, oh, we're going to be interested in labor, jobs, localizing jobs, we're going to be focused on the environment, we're going to do corporate governance, including executive pay issues. What do you guys think about this as something that is how it's going to play out over the next probably 5 years? Thomas, let's start with you on that one.
Oh, so the question of stakeholders as shareholders, how is this going to?
And the story of profits versus profits and costs versus probably what it's called social environmental issues.
Right. That's a big topic. So I can shoot from the hip as well as anybody, but I'm not sure. I certainly can't contribute from my own research on this one. So
no, that's okay.
So I guess you as a company, you in principle, or it's by the governance structure, you're beholden to your shareholders, and that's if you follow the rule book. But nobody is an island. I mean, none of us is an island. Neither are companies. You have to exist in the societal context, and there are issues that arise that you can't ignore. So to the extent that you sell primarily to consumers as end users, and vehicle companies do that, I think it makes it's a smart business to understand what the issues are surrounding your product. So if you're making vehicles to be ignorant of developments regarding emissions and climate change, that would be, maybe it's profitable in the short run, but it may not be profitable in the long run. So I don't have an answer as to how these things will play out. But I guess what I submit to you is, economists like to talk about objective functions and what do individuals or companies optimize. Companies maximize profits, but they're constrained. They're constrained not just by their shareholder concerns and by what the rates of the loans and whatever else they have to take on, but they're also constrained by other items. And so societal cross currents, concerns about the future, that may not be the pandemic as much as it may be about other topics. That is something you have to factor in. And those things are not constant over time. So they matter. I guess let me just stop right there.
Mike, what's your take on that?
Not sure I have much incremental over Thomas, other than displaying a willingness to speculate out of ignorance. But back in January, when there was a smaller meeting of GERPISA, one of the topics was the timeline coming from regulation for some of these wider societal goals versus the status of the technology that would enable these goals to be met at a price point that consumers were willing to face. So we've seen in certain markets a big increase in EV subsidies that are attempting to push these societal goals forward. But I think we still have some very great tensions in the background between those who would like to see lower emissions and greater electrification, or not electrification. The political debate really has come down to battery electric vehicles as opposed to using electrification to vastly increase fuel efficiency. And so there are these underlying tensions, and those have not gone away. And the underlying regulatory clocks have not yet been reset because of the pandemic. So we'll see
Mike,
what
thanks
happens.
for the plug. Thanks for the setup for the plug for my Powertrain Strategies Conference on July 15th. Tipping points for EVs, question mark. Greg, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Oh, well, I don't think I can give you an answer. I can give you a response and fill up some air and hook it back to the pandemic from the perspective of what's happened in Canada over the last 3 months or so. And there's a really strong effort on behalf of the Canadian automotive industry, and I salute them to do what they could to improve the supply chain in terms of ventilators and make ventilators, and parts for ventilators, and make personal protection equipment and make personal protection equipment available, and pivot in Oshawa, which frankly used to make 1 million vehicles a year, found themselves with a few people making face masks, and they're continuing to do that. Maria and Linmar were adding parts to ventilators, and we can have a debate about whether or not those were the efforts or the actions were efforts to pivot the company on a long-term basis. I don't think they were. Were they efforts to be good corporate citizens? And I think that they were. They efforts in some of those circumstances to take pressure away from some of the challenges in their industry and say, look, we're doing, and probably figure out the company, look, we're doing efforts for the pandemic, or we're doing other things around R&D. Don't pay attention to some of these other things that we let slide over the course of a period of time. But companies are constantly doing this. And so are they doing it for PR? Are they doing it to pivot their company? Are they doing it because it's the right thing to do? The answer to that is probably yes.
Yeah.
And the really important lesson out of all of this is not necessarily about stakeholder value, but it's about the importance of manufacturing in general and automotive manufacturing in particular. Frankly, we wouldn't have been able to fix some of those problems, and we wouldn't if we didn't have whether or not they were specifically healthcare manufacturers, but we wouldn't be able to deal with some of those things if we didn't have a strong base. So these countries like Canada and the US that have had a tendency over the past 2 generations to be somewhat dismissive of manufacturing. I think we've all had a really strong lesson over the past 3 months that manufacturing matters, and manufacturing matters for more than just the specific things they make, cars, but manufacturers have a lot of capability, and we need to lean on them, and we have leaned on them for the last 3 months. So that's an important lesson that I hope we don't lose sight of. And so this is a heavy price to pay for that lesson, but it's an important lesson nonetheless.
Thanks, Greg. The one of the questions that came in was for you is to could you provide an overall picture of the Canadian supply chain in terms of number of suppliers and the current employment levels, probably for the industry as a whole, but also supply base?
Actually, we're going through an interesting process right now, or I've been peripherally involved, but there are some people involved trying to do a better job of quantifying the size of the Canadian automotive industry. We have a strong tendency, and you'll understand this, to say, what are the NAICS codes, North American Industrial Classification Systems codes, and oh, those are the ones. Oh, they make cars or they make parts, and that's the automotive industry. And by that standard, we're about 135,000 people in the Canadian, or 120,000 people rather in the Canadian automotive industry, give or take. But the reality is there are a lot of companies that sell a large proportion of their output to the automotive industry, but they're foam companies, even though they make even though Woodbridge, for example, only makes foam for the automotive industry, or they're steel companies, or there's something else or something else. And so as we've gone through that process, the numbers are not 120,000; they're about 180,000 of employment, and 5 OEMs making vehicles in Canada, and about 500 suppliers supplying them, and of course all of the U.S. auto industry as well, because we are completely integrated.
Very good, thank you. Got some good questions here. Mike, you can have some fun with this one because you always do. It says, you've always been quite pessimistic about the capacity of Tesla of being able to survive. A crisis like this should make Tesla's life much harder, but it does not seem to be the case. Do you have comments on the outlook for Tesla?
I cannot explain how a company that has generated profits at the most meager levels and is not growing particularly fast is second only to Toyota in terms of market capitalization. They have 2 assembly plants, which would be just an infinitesimal scale globally. So they need to be raising lots of capital while they have $1,000 a share price. And if they can do that, they can last for a long while until Musk is dead and buried and they bring in, management with stability and operational experience. But it's very hard to see what's happening there. The initial numbers suggest that Model Y isn't doing great. Model 3 is, they're selling out of inventory, basically. And they're paying bonuses to salespeople in the US. So they're looking just like any other car company, except that these are all fixed costs for Tesla. And the capital for the inventory is having to come out of Tesla's pocket rather than being borne by independent dealerships. So we'll see how this plays out, but they don't seem to be particularly dynamic in ability to bring new models to market or have a real impact in total sales.
Yeah, they've had some really good success this year with the Model 3 in China, and it's the best-selling electric vehicle in China, and they sell a lot of electric vehicles in China in general. So it looks like a good move on their part to be in China.
Yes, but they still remain a very low volume producer by the standards of the auto industry.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
We'll see. And selling a new model in China, there is a big new model announcement, first to market effect, and whether that will be maintained. And of course, they are totally out of reach for most vehicle purchasers. So they remain a very expensive vehicle in the Chinese context. So we'll see how that develops. But the profits of the China plant aren't going to flow back to the parent company the way that it's structured. So it will be a very curious shareholder proposition that I don't see how sales in China should translate back into market valuations. but then the stock market doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me right now.
Now, Greg, in the U.S., the many of the auto companies have been putting out a lot of pretty good deals for consumers to buy new vehicles. Ford has adopted the Hyundai program from the recession, where if you lose your job, we'll buy the car back from you. That kind of story, which worked very well for Hyundai during the recession. Is the same thing going on in Canada?
I think the answer is a little bit, but I haven't seen it to the same degree as what we saw, for example, in 2008, 2009, when, with the cash for clunkers from a government program or even at the OEM. The OEMs are doing what they need to do, and they're constantly adjusting their mix. I haven't seen any outrageously generous incentives that we saw 8 or 10 years ago. We may see them at some point in time. There's been some, just switching gears a little bit, that isn't a direct response. There's been some discussion of or advocacy for a cash for clunkers type deal. I don't know. I mean, I can see where the benefit of that would be for the Canadian manufacturing industry if the U.S. government implemented that. 90% of the vehicles that are made in Canada go to the U.S. In other words, the cash for clunkers program in Canada would help the dealers a little bit, but it wouldn't necessarily help the manufacturing industry. But it might help the manufacturing industry a little bit in the U.S. and have a very small impact on Canada. So we haven't seen that yet. It's not to suggest that it won't happen, but as of July 1, 2020, it's relatively muted.
Mike?
Yes, I continue to be fascinated by some of the short-run dynamics. I received out of the blue a $200 check from my car insurance company. Why? Well, with fewer miles being driven, the level of claims is well below what they had priced in. And the only way they can retain business is to make sure that other insurance companies don't underbid them and steal away customers. So they're being very proactive there. But financing cars is relatively inexpensive now. There are lots of rebates. And the longer that the crisis goes on, the greater the mandate that cash is king when you're in a crisis, and the greater the pressure of the car companies to be losing a little bit of money by giving away cars rather than losing a lot of money by not making any cars. So I think we're going to see those dynamics. And in the United States in particular, we have very low fuel costs. Again, it varies from state to state. I'm no longer able to pay under $1 a gallon for gasoline locally, but I'm still paying under $2 a gallon the last time I bought gas. So there are these big short-run swings that interact across the value chain in unexpected ways. So I think the answer, though, comes down to if the levels of infections drop off fairly quickly, then we'll see a fairly V-shaped nature in the auto industry in North America. But what I see happening in healthcare at the moment, we are going to continue to have very high rates of infection into the fall, and that will have a lot of ramifications.
Unfortunately, Mike, my insurance company sent me a check for $2.85. So I didn't get the $200 check that you got. Now, this brings up the issue.
That may be a mark of overpaying to start with on my end.
One of the issues that has been brought up here is the government support during the pandemic. Thomas, what have you seen from the government in terms of supporting manufacturers and suppliers, if anything?
So
Or consumers?
So there's been a number of programs that have been rolled out, right? So, I mean, just to put things in perspective, we talked about being in a recession, but this is not a typical recession by any stretch of the imagination. This is a healthcare recession. This is a medical shock to our economy. We've never seen anything like this before. None of us was alive in 1918. And even though, never mind. So you take the economy that was operating extremely high levels of activity, and you put it in the deep freeze from today to tomorrow, and so you start with that, and that, I think that sort of drives your support programs, right? There were fiscal policy and there was monetary policy in the U.S. perspective. That's what I'm talking about here. There was nothing specific to autos, and as we're looking at it, there was no need for that at this point. There hasn't been any need for that at this point. We talked about this. I mentioned this earlier. Auto retail, new and especially used, has been doing much better than expected if you were starting with the parameters of a recession as deep as we're having it right now. So what has the government done? There's been income support and support of small businesses, a rather generous unemployment insurance, then the stimulus checks, and then there have been all kinds of innovative programs to support liquidity targeted to both large and small businesses. I'm not going to go into further detail than that. But the stimulus check was $1,200, and then any used car dealer will tell you that's typically what people put down to buy a used car. And these data actually line up. There's high frequency data on used car purchases. They line up pretty well when the first wave of checks started arriving in people's mailboxes. Household incomes actually went up because of the stimulus. So nothing auto industry specific. I know in Europe, several countries have talked about that, and then taken the playbook of combining sort of stimulative program with other objectives. So, in Germany and in France, they're sort of not supporting internal combustion engine vehicles, but rather, either directly EVs or non-ICE propulsion systems and so on and so forth. That's reminiscent of what happened here with cash for clunkers in 2008, 2009. We're not at this point because the industry is doing rather well. You talk to the dealer body anyway. But there have been broad-based stimulus packages, and if you look at this from a macroeconomic perspective, to what extent the central bank balance sheets have risen, to what extent debt to GDP ratios have gone up around the world. This is unprecedented. Okay, so that makes what happened 10 years ago during the Great Recession. That makes it almost looks like a piece of cake. Okay, we're nearly twice as much in terms of these measures.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah.
The one thing that we shouldn't lose sight of, and maybe the dynamics are likely to change as we move forward, but the reality is there has not been a need at the OEM level to institute dramatic incentives on vehicles, unlike in 2008-09, because in 2008-09 they continued to push cars out the factory door. Our factory doors were shut for 2 months, so the supply hasn't been pushing and pushing. And if things change over the next few months, and people continue to don't buy cars and continue to push cars out the door, and we continue to not have summer shutdowns for factories, then there may be a slightly different dynamic, and the OEMs think again about the level of incentives. But there are different structural impediments in place.
Yeah.
Years ago.
Thomas, you made the point about European subsidies, and this is also true in China. They're giving subsidies to there are central government subsidies, but even the provinces themselves are giving subsidies. And of course, the one that strikes us the most is, I think, the French subsidy, and we'll probably hear about this tomorrow. 12,000 euros if you trade in an ICE vehicle for an EV, or maybe a plug-in hybrid, but definitely for an EV. 12,000 euros. I was struck by that. And I know that the Italian government is also giving support to the industry. I don't know if it's going to the consumers or if it's going to, consumer to build demand, or is it just going to manufacturers and suppliers for support, or both. And as you said, Germany as well. We'll hear about this a little more tomorrow. One of the questions that's popped up here, it has to do with the electric vehicle in the United States. It says yesterday's roundtable was a little focused on OEMs, investment in battery manufacturers and raw materials, kind of in preparation for EVs. Do you guys see anything of this going on in the U.S., or how do you see it playing out in the U.S. In the short term? Mike, let's start with you on this one.
Well, there's certainly some activity in terms of building of battery manufacturers, both engaging in R&D and building some capacity. So I'm tangentially familiar with A123, which I think is actually had been based in the Ann Arbor area where you are, Bruce, and went through bankruptcy and bought up by a Chinese company, but they're in the lithium iron phosphate rather than the cobalt based, and it has different sets of applications. So for the light electrification, they're in a very good position. But I'm trying on more or less a weekly basis to look at what's been happening in battery chemistry, and also looking for announcements of new sorts of batteries showing up in cell phones, because cell phones are the high value use for batteries relative to cars. If you can double cell phone battery life, it's a cell phone company will pay a huge amount of money for that. A car company is it will not pay a premium price. And so far, these sorts of new battery chemistries look like they might at best be available for the auto industry in 2025. So there are some intermediate economies of scale in pack production, but I still see the electrification in the pure battery electric vehicles being a long ways off. And in the meantime, light electrification, generator motors that provide power boost and can drive a car at low speeds for a while. Those technologies continue to improve quite rapidly. So, this is still, from my perspective, quite a ways off from being commercially viable. A Tesla does not provide a value proposition to the average car producer. You pay a lot extra up front and you save relatively little in the way of operating costs until you're well into the life cycle of a vehicle, where you might have engine maintenance affect you in a regular vehicle. Of course, if you like traveling at high speeds, a Tesla is unparalleled for that. But that's only a small slice, a well-heeled slice of the car buying public. But electric vehicles are not yet ready for the mass market in the U.S. context, and there's little willingness so far to subsidize to the point of offsetting that.
Anyone else have a piece of that? I know that the interesting thing to me was the joint venture that was launched between General Motors and LG Chem. They're building a plant in Ohio. And this is different from the relationship that LG Chem had with GM in the past. Now, the Bolt and the Volt are I think, LG Chem batteries, but it was not a joint venture. It was basically a supplier providing batteries to a manufacturer. But in this Ohio plant, it's a joint venture. So so GM has a little more skin in the game now from a LG Chem standpoint.
Another way of looking at it is that Panasonic was badly burned by Tesla, and other battery companies want some skin in the game from their purchasers.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, good point. Anybody else on that one, on that particular topic?
So the way I think about this is if you're a mass producer, so electrification, sort of the origins there come from the regulatory side, and I think Bruce, you alluded to that earlier. If this thing's going to have legs, it's going to be commercially viable at some point. So the question is, what's your short-term outlook and what's your long-term outlook as an OEM, and how has that changed with what we're currently observing? So the pandemic isn't helping, and one of the reasons is it not helping. The main reason is because the channel through the price of oil is actually going directly against making a viable case for having, an EV being a commercially viable product in the absence of regulation. On the other hand, when you look at announcements, right? So I haven't seen, you got to go what companies announce. Nobody has defected from that strategy. And you have to look beyond the pandemic. So the potential opportunities in the game here are, and I mentioned that earlier, it is unclear how, when the dust settles after this pandemic, where the new balance is between private and public transportation. So there are opportunities. So an economist would refer to this as a shift of the demand curve, potentially. I don't think we have seen enough of that yet, because the people that would primarily go to make the switch are currently still working from home. And so they quite haven't gotten to that decision point yet. So I think there's more to come on that. So that's the opportunity, right? But then it comes back to the consumer. You go shopping for a vehicle and look at different propulsion technologies. You also look at your pocketbook. And so, that matters greatly in the end.
Greg, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, I'm not an expert in battery technology, but I think the interest, I look at these things from an industrial policy perspective. And the interesting thing from about Tesla, for example, and the other firms that are entering the environment is the speed at which they're growing. And Tesla's been we're very interested in Tesla for lots of different reasons, but they've been at this for 17 years now. And consistent with Mike's point, they're now making as many vehicles as Toyota, for example, makes in the province of Ontario. So this is starting a new OEM is difficult is difficult work. But I think what Tesla has done, interestingly, although not maybe directly, it has inspired other firms to enter this industry where the barriers to entry are very, very high. We look at Nikola. I'm really interested in Turkey, which is getting ready to build cars in 2022, electric vehicles. And where does that go, and where does it take it? As a Canadian, I'm really interested in these because they're OEMs, and you fellas that I'm sharing the screen with may have some appreciation for this, but less than a Canadian would, because we understand the importance of headquarters. You have headquarters and all the positive things, and Mike, you talked a little bit about R&D close to headquarters. Our R&D, and I've talked about this at GERPISA in the past, is that the R&D of even our biggest suppliers, tier one suppliers like Magna, doesn't happen in Canada. It happens across the road from the OEMs in Detroit or someplace else. So the barriers to entry that are perceived to be lower for battery electric vehicle companies may be real, but they may not be real, but they are certainly inspiring new companies. So what is going to happen with Nikola, Rivian, TOG, and are there parallels for other countries like Canada that don't have an OEM to anchor production or to inspire the R&D? So we'll see where that goes.
We're getting close to the end of our time here. There's one question I wanted to bring up, and it came up in the questions that somebody was talking about already. Had to do with the potential changeover or movement because of COVID-19 away from mass transit, away from shared transportation, from Uber, from any kind of thing that's shared in that respect. there's this movement to people saying, I want a car. I want to be in a car. I want to be in this cocoon of my car. And some of my students in China are telling me that all the social media is lighting up. It says, I want to have a car because I want to be protected. Do you guys see this having any long-term, and again, this is short-term effects, right, of the pandemic. Do you guys see this having a long-term effect on vehicle sales? It could be used car, could be new car, could be either. But when you think about it, cities really can't deal with this. It just means more congestion in the cities. Cities don't want to have to deal with this. But is this this thing going to have legs? Let's start with you, Thomas.
I've been thinking about this question a lot. So you can go back. So there's some data on, not directly comparable, somewhat comparable. I believe it had to do with London Transport. They built a new line and they had to shut an existing line down. And then they ended up surveying the people and which way they got to work and which route they took. And it turns out after their old line was open again, they had discovered different ways. It may be the same mode, but it was a different route. So there were some permanent effects and they were larger than what researchers had expected. Will this thing have legs? I think that primarily depends on what the virus does and how that story is playing out. The longer it messes with us, I think the longer will the legs be of this phenomenon of on the margin switching out of public transit. In Chicago, the CTA and Metro, the citywide, and basically Chicago citywide and the metropolitan area-wide provider of transit have been operating at 90% below capacity, for months, right?
Wow.
Now, yes, so how do you solve this? You cannot go, those people that used to take public transit, and I'm one of them, I don't have to do it right now because I'm working out of my basement, but at some point I look forward to going back to the office. Now, I don't want to drive my car. Do I have to carpool like I used to do with my kids when they went to sports practices? I have no idea how this is going to play out. But when you look at what's going on in Italy, for example, or in Europe, so they're putting in more bike lanes, public transit capacity is much reduced because you want to keep the social distancing active. So they're running more trains to the extent that they can, but you can't have as many people on them. So this is a big problem, all right? Logistically, it's a big problem. How do we get all the people to work? And at the margin, some of them will move to private cars. There's no doubt in my mind. How long will this last? Will this last until the car is ready to be dumped again in 5 or 10 years? I have no clue. But this is something that nobody had the ability to anticipate, and it's throwing a lot of things, upside down. What's going to happen to public transit systems? They need major support, otherwise they're going to go bankrupt.
Michael.
The ability to use your own car is very much a function of what city you live in, what part of the world. Residence versus workplace, these are things that are very challenging to change dramatically in the short run. Mm-hmm. And while we can see some shift to work from home, I haven't been in to pick up mail since March. No idea what might be there at my office, or I retired, so I don't have an office now. But these sorts of things are there, and there will be some marginal shifts. But I think the ability to use a car versus the need to take public transportation is going to be very hard to make major shifts in over the short run. And I think the longer run time horizon needed for these shifts is something that we sure pray is long past COVID is affecting behavior. So we'll see short run pain as people realize that their only feasible way to get into work in Manhattan is by subway because there's no parking. They may not have a car. The cost of going through the tunnels or the bridge and the time involved with an increase in congestion that's likely. There's no room for adjustment. And it will be a very painful thing for the next 6 months, perhaps. But 2 years from now, I rather suspect that this will have been a passing fad, and we'll be back to where we were a few months ago.
So mass transit and Uber survive?
Well, Uber, if they can decide to make some money in their underlying business.
Yeah.
But, you know, the taxis are not going to go away.
Very good.
But whether Uber remains the player that they are at present in taxis, we'll see.
Yeah. Greg, you got anything on this?
Very briefly, the really interesting dynamic to me is that we've moved from work in your workplace, and this all happened in 3 months, to work from home, and now we're moving to work from anywhere. And so there will be some implications to that in terms of development of where people live, where people want to live, and ultimately how people are going to get around. And if you're going to work from any place, and maybe you'll be working someplace like I am today, which is a long ways away from any urban development, you're going to need a car. And so that will have some impact on working, and people will not have to drive into the city, not have to drive into town. They're going to be working from home, and that'll have an effect. But they're going to need a vehicle because they're going to be living in places where they're going to need a vehicle. The other thing is that, and this speaks directly to your question, to the question, is, and I want to be careful the way I say this, but I think almost uniquely in North America, public transit has been, and certainly in Canada, public transit has been aspirational. Good public transit, aspirational. We know that we should be on public transit, but public transit has been the way of getting around for poor people. And that's not, that sounds awful, and it is. And cars are for people that know that can have a car and get someplace in a car with the flexibility that provides. I think that this COVID-19 has set back any steps that we have been making in order to eliminate or erase that perception and that societal shortcoming that we've had about public transit and who takes public transit and who does not. Because there are people now that are looking at a bus and think, boy, thanks for the good graces that I don't have to be in that bus today. I can go where I'm going today in my vehicle. So that's going to have an effect. And I think it may be a slightly different way of articulating what Thomas was describing as we started that particular discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Greg. I think that wraps it up for us today. I think this last question is going to be a great introduction into the European session tomorrow, because we always know how good the mass transit systems are in Europe. And it'll be interesting to hear their take on how this is playing out within their context. And does it actually mean more vehicles in Europe? So again, I want to thank everybody for participating. For all for you who are online, are still interested in the topic, the European Roundtable is tomorrow. The emerging markets, the Brazil, Mexico, and India tomorrow on Friday. And again, I want to thank our presenters and speakers for helping us today. We had I think a very good overall presentation by everybody, and we even learned some stuff today.
Yeah, and let me remind those who have yet to do so that there are many excellent presentations up on virtual presentations on the GERPISA website. So we haven't been able to meet in person with all the serendipitous conversations that come from that. So working from home is no substitute for meeting in person, but it isn't a zero substitute either. It is a partial substitute and we can take advantage of what is available. Thomas has a presentation there, and I've listened to those of Glenn Mercer. After all, the dealership side employs far more people than manufacturing, and he provides some real insights into what's been going on there. So,
All right.
but thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks.
Take care, you guys.
Good seeing you all. See you later.